The mountain man who waited 10 winters for love, until the deaf mail-order bride arrived. What happened next left the town in surprise. Now let's dive into this amazing story. The mountains of Montana were cruel in winter. Snow drifted like ghosts between the pine trees, and the silence could drive a man mad if he wasn't already halfway there. For 10 long winters, Elijah Boone had lived alone in a cabin he'd built with his own hands, a sturdy structure of pine and stone, perched at the edge of Bitter Creek Ridge. The wind sang through the cracks, the fire snapped in the hearth, and that was the only company he kept. Every morning he split wood, fed his mules, and checked his traps. His beard had gone from chestnut to silver in those years, and his voice, once warm and steady, had grown rusty from disuse. The people in the town below had long stopped expecting him to come down except for supplies. When he did, they whispered, "That's Boone, the one who lost his fiancée in the blizzard. Don't speak to him much. He ain't right in the head no more." And maybe they were right. Because after Mary Ellen had died, frozen less than a mile from the cabin while trying to bring him a Christmas meal, Elijah had stopped believing in laughter. He'd stopped believing in God too most days. The mountain had taken everything from him. Yet still he stayed. He'd tried leaving once after the 4th winter, but the world beyond Bitter Creek was louder, meaner, emptier somehow. The mountain, for all its cruelty, was honest. It demanded everything from a man but never lied to him. But this 10th winter, something changed. The loneliness had grown so thick he could almost taste it. Nights stretched endlessly, the silence pressing against his chest like weight. One bitter evening, as snow lashed the windows, Elijah sat at his table, a half-empty bottle of rye beside him, and stared at a stack of old letters. One of them, yellowed and torn, was from a friend in town, Jonas Wright, who'd married a mail-order bride from back east. He'd written, "The agency sent me a fine woman, Elijah. Kind, gentle, with a spirit stronger than any man I've met. If the mountains are too lonely for you, maybe try your hand at love again." Elijah had scoffed when he first read it. Love again? After losing Mary Ellen? That was a fool's dream. But now, as the wind howled like a lonely beast outside, he found himself reaching for a pen. His handwriting was clumsy, out of practice. But he wrote, "To whom it may concern. I am a man of few words and hard living. My home is deep in the Montana mountains. I do not have riches nor fine manners. But I have a good roof, steady work, and a heart that has learned to be kind again. If there is a woman who seeks peace and will not fear the wild, I will welcome her. Elijah Boone." He sealed the letter and stared at it for a long time, wondering if he was making a fool of himself. But a small, flickering hope, something he thought had died long ago, stirred inside him. The next morning he rode through the snow down to Bitter Creek, mailed the letter, and rode back without saying a word to anyone. Days passed. Then weeks. Then months. The snow melted, turned to mud, then froze again. He almost forgot about the letter, until one January morning he rode into town for flour and kerosene and found Jonas Wright running toward him from the telegraph office, waving a yellow slip of paper. "Boone," Jonas shouted. "You best read this." Elijah frowned and unfolded the telegram with calloused fingers. The ink was smudged, but the words were clear. "Bride en route. Name Clara Whitmore. Stop. Stop. Will arrive on coach Sunday. Stop." He stared at it, reading it twice, then 3 times. The word echoed in his mind. He felt a strange mix of panic and guilt. What kind of life could he offer a woman who couldn't hear, who would come to a cabin where even the wind screamed? Would she be frightened? Would she regret coming? The townsfolk, hearing the news, started whispering again. Some laughed behind their hands. "Boone's got himself a deaf wife coming. She'll run screaming before the first snow." But Elijah said nothing. He simply folded the telegram, tucked it into his coat, and went to the general store. He bought sugar, flour, candles, and, for the first time in 10 years, a ribbon. A blue one. That night, he returned to the cabin and scrubbed it clean until the wood floors shone. He polished his rifle, washed his one good shirt, and repaired the loose shutter Mary Ellen had once complained about. When he finally sat by the fire, staring into the flames, he realized something startling. He was nervous. Nervous like a boy. Outside, the mountain groaned beneath new snow, the wind howling as if to test him. But this time, Elijah didn't listen. He was already waiting, for a woman he'd never met, who couldn't hear his voice, yet somehow might be the first person in a decade to truly see him. And as dawn broke over Bitter Creek Ridge, painting the mountains gold, Elijah Boone whispered into the empty cabin. "If she comes, I'll never let her face this winter alone." The snow had fallen steady for 3 days straight. The air was sharp enough to bite, and the town of Bitter Creek lay under a white hush, broken only by the crunch of boots and the creak of wagon wheels. At the far end of the muddy street, where the trail split toward the mountains, Elijah Boone waited beside the weather-beaten stagecoach station. His horse, Duke, stamped at the frost, breath steaming in the air. Elijah's gloved hands fidgeted at his sides, not from cold, but from nerves he hadn't felt in 10 long winters. The townsfolk gathered like they always did when there was something to whisper about. Men leaned against posts, pretending to smoke. Women peeked out from the mercantile windows. Everyone wanted to see the moment the wild mountain man met the deaf bride he'd ordered by post. The old clock above the general store struck noon. The rumble of wheels echoed faintly in the distance. The stage was combing. Elijah's heart began to hammer. He tried to steady himself, straightening the collar of his worn coat, brushing snow off his hat brim. It had been years since he'd cared how he looked. But today he did. When the stagecoach finally rolled into view, pulled by 4 dust-colored horses, it brought with it a cloud of snow and noise, the crack of the driver's whip, the shouts of greeting, the jingle of harnesses. The coach stopped with a hiss of brakes, and from within stepped a woman, Clara Whitmore. Elijah froze. She was smaller than he'd imagined, wrapped in a plain brown coat and a shawl that looked too thin for the cold. A lock of chestnut hair escaped her bonnet, and her cheeks were flushed pink from the chill. Her eyes, wide, clear, the color of warm honey, searched the crowd. The driver hopped down, shouting, "Miss Whitmore, your man's here somewhere." But Clara didn't flinch. She didn't even glance toward the noise. Instead, her gaze moved carefully, scanning faces until it landed on Elijah, the only man holding a small wooden sign he'd carved himself, marked simply, C.W. When she saw it, her lips parted in a soft smile, one that hit Elijah like sunlight breaking through fog. She approached him slowly, clutching a worn travel bag to her chest. Her boots sank into the snow, and the soundless rhythm of her steps made the moment feel unreal, like time had slowed to a whisper. Elijah swallowed hard. He took off his hat and nodded. "Ma'am," he said, voice gruff and uncertain. Clara tilted her head, watching his lips carefully. Then she smiled again and signed something, her hands moving with fluid grace. Elijah didn't understand the shapes she made, but somehow he understood the meaning. It was gentle, grateful, like she was saying thank you. He pointed to his chest, slow and awkward. "Elijah," then pointed to her. "Clara?" She nodded. Then, to his surprise, she reached out and touched her fingertips to her heart, and pointed to him. Elijah's breath caught. That single gesture, so simple, so full of quiet warmth, said more than any words could have. Behind them, the townsfolk whispered like dry leaves. "Well, I'll be." He really did it. "She can't hear a thing, poor soul. She won't last a week up there." Elijah ignored them. He lifted her bag gently from her arms and offered his gloved hand. She hesitated, just a heartbeat, then placed her small, trembling fingers into his palm. Her hand was cold, his rough and scarred. But when their skin met, something wordless passed between them, understanding maybe, or need. They walked toward his horse, the whispers following them like shadows. When he helped her mount, she glanced at the snow-covered peaks in the distance. His home, and her eyes widened. The wildness of the mountains didn't seem to frighten her. It called to her. Elijah climbed up behind her, his voice low. "It's a hard ride. You hold on, all right?" She turned her head slightly, reading his lips, then nodded and tightened her grip on the saddle horn. With a snap of the reins they rode off. The town faded behind them, replaced by open silence, white hills, frozen pines, and the deep rhythm of hooves against packed snow. For miles they said nothing. Yet Elijah found himself watching her reflection in the mirror of his mind. The way she looked up at the trees, the way she smiled faintly when sunlight caught the snow like glass. When they stopped to rest near the river, he offered her his canteen. She drank, then pointed toward the mountains and signed something he didn't understand. He shrugged, embarrassed. She laughed, a soundless laugh that somehow filled the air. Then she drew a simple image in the snow, 2 mountains side by side, a small cabin between them. Then she looked up at him and pointed to herself. He realized then she wasn't afraid. She was ready. By the time the sun dipped low and the cabin came into view, Elijah's nervousness had shifted into something new, admiration. The woman behind him on the saddle had crossed an entire country alone. Uncertain. Brave enough to face the wilderness for a chance at a home. As he helped her down from the horse, the cabin door creaked open in welcome, and for the first time in 10 winters, Elijah Boone's mountain didn't feel like a prison. It felt like it had been waiting for her. And though not a word had been spoken, both of them knew something had begun. The first morning on Bitter Creek Mountain dawned white and quiet. The kind of quiet that only the wilderness knew, the hush of snow on pine boughs, the sigh of wind slipping between rocks. Inside the cabin, a thin thread of smoke curled from the chimney. Elijah Boone woke before the sun as he always did, but today felt different. He wasn't alone. He sat up on his cot, glancing across the room. Clara Whitmore was already awake, standing by the hearth. The firelight painted her face in gold and amber. Her hair, loosened from travel, shimmered like warm chestnut. She moved with quiet grace, stirring the pot over the fire, arranging tin plates on the table. She didn't make a sound, yet everything she did felt alive. Elijah watched her for a long moment, unsure how to begin the day. He was used to silence, but not this kind. Hers was peaceful, not empty. When she turned and saw him watching, she smiled. He cleared his throat awkwardly, pulling on his boots. "Mornin'," he said softly. She tilted her head, reading his lips, then nodded, mouthing back a single word he could barely read. "Morning." Something warm flickered in his chest. The day passed slow. They worked side by side, mending fences, fetching water, sweeping snow from the roof. Elijah had never been so aware of another person before. Every gesture mattered. Every look had weight. He'd point to things, trying to speak with his hands: the axe, the firewood, the kettle. Sometimes she'd understand. Sometimes she'd laugh, a soundless burst of joy, her shoulders shaking, her smile wide as dawn. Once, when she slipped on ice near the woodpile, he caught her before she fell. Their faces ended up inches apart. He smelled her hair, faint lavender beneath the scent of smoke and cold air. Neither of them moved for a heartbeat. Then she stepped back, cheeks pink, eyes sparkling with something shy and new. Elijah found himself grinning, the first real grin in years. That night, after supper, Clara sat by the fire, sewing a small tear in her shawl. Elijah sat across from her, whittling a piece of pine into a small bird. The room was lit only by firelight, warm and flickering. He wanted to talk, but words felt clumsy. So he decided to try. He pointed to himself. "Elijah." Then slowly, uncertainly, he touched his chest again and mouthed, "My name." Clara's eyes softened. She set aside her sewing, leaned forward, and took his rough hand in hers. With her other hand she made slow, deliberate shapes in the air, spelling out letters with graceful precision. H. He watched her hands, then tried to copy the motions. His fingers were stiff and awkward, but she laughed gently and guided them, correcting him until he got it right. Then she pointed to herself. "Clara," and showed him how to sign her name. They practiced for what felt like hours. The fire burned low. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the cabin there was warmth, not just from the flames, but from something new forming between them. Before turning in for the night, Elijah pointed to the little bird he'd carved and handed it to her. She ran her fingers over the smooth wood, then looked up at him, signing a word he didn't yet know. But her eyes told him enough. Meant thank you. In the days that followed, they began to build a quiet rhythm, a language of glances, gestures, and smiles. When Elijah chopped wood, she'd hand him logs before he could ask. When she baked bread, he'd appear with the water bucket before she looked up. It was as though the silence between them had turned into its own kind of music, one only they could hear. Sometimes he'd catch her standing by the window, watching snow drift across the valley. Her lips would move, soft and slow, as if she were whispering prayers no one could hear. One evening, he wrote a few words on a scrap of paper and handed it to her. "Do you miss talking?" She read it, then smiled sadly and took his hand, guiding his fingers to rest against her chest, where her heartbeat pulsed strong and steady. Then she mouthed a single word, "No." In that moment, Elijah realized she didn't live in silence. She lived in stillness. And for the first time in 10 winters, he felt peace in that same stillness too. As the snow deepened and the nights grew longer, their connection grew without a single promise spoken aloud. One night, as the fire crackled low, she traced words on his palm, letters he could feel but not see. "Ichomi." He looked at her, puzzled. She smiled, pointed to the cabin, then to him. And Elijah Boone, the man who had spent 10 winters believing his heart was dead, realized he'd built a home not with timber or stone but with trust. And it began with the quiet courage of a woman who never needed sound to speak. The mountain gave no warnings. One morning, the sky above Bitter Creek Ridge turned the color of lead, and a low growl rolled across the peaks. Thunder without lightning, the kind that only meant one thing: a blizzard was coming. Elijah Boone stood outside the cabin, hat low against the wind, studying the horizon. Snow had begun to fall in slow, heavy flakes, big as feathers, and the wind smelled like ice and danger. He turned back toward the cabin where Clara was stacking kindling by the hearth. She looked up as he entered, reading the concern in his face before he even spoke. He signed clumsily, a gesture they'd practiced, "Storm coming." She nodded, already moving, filling buckets with water, checking the larder, securing blankets. They'd faced small storms before, but this one felt different. The air had weight to it. The sky pressed down on the land like a hand. By nightfall, the wind screamed through the pines. The cabin shook with each gust. The fire danced wildly, throwing long shadows across the walls. Elijah barred the door and checked every window latch twice. He looked at Clara, calm, collected, fearless as ever, and something inside him ached. He didn't want this mountain to test her. Not yet. The next morning, the storm had worsened. Snow piled up to the windowsills. The roof groaned under the weight. Elijah pulled on his coat. "Gotta clear the roof," he mouthed. Clara frowned and caught his sleeve, shaking her head firmly. She pointed to the storm outside, the thick white blur where the world vanished beyond the glass. He smiled softly, brushing a thumb across her hand. "I'll be quick." She could read the promise on his lips, though her eyes filled with worry. When he stepped outside, the wind hit him like a wall, fierce, blinding. He could barely see 3 feet ahead. Still, he climbed the ladder, clearing snow with the shovel, each movement heavier than the last. He didn't see the ice building on the ridge above the cabin. Didn't hear the deep crack before the snow gave way. The world exploded in white. The avalanche wasn't large, but it was enough to knock him clear off his feet, tumbling down the slope. He crashed hard against a fallen pine and lay there stunned, his body half buried, his head spinning. Back in the cabin, Clara felt the walls tremble. The door rattled violently. She looked toward the window, saw nothing but a wall of snow. She waited, staring at the door. 1 minute, then 2, then 5. Her hands began to shake. She ran to the door and yanked it open, the cold slashing her face instantly. She called out his name, though no sound left her lips. Only the movement of her mouth, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The storm howled around her. But she went anyway. She tied one end of a rope to the cabin door and looped the other around her waist, stepping into the white blur. The snow came waist-deep in places. Her fingers burned from cold. Her vision blurred with tears. Then a glint. Metal. Half buried under snow. She stumbled forward, clawing at the drifts with numb hands until she uncovered Elijah's rifle. Her breath caught. She dropped to her knees, digging faster, screaming silently until her fingers brushed fabric. Then flesh. He was there, pale, cold, but alive. She pulled him free, slung his arm over her shoulder, and dragged him back toward the rope line. Inch by inch. Step by agonizing step. The storm beat against her, but she didn't stop. Not once. When they reached the cabin, she collapsed beside him, sobbing, silent tears streaking her face. Hours later, Elijah woke to the sound of the fire crackling. He was wrapped in furs, his head resting on her lap. Clara's eyes were red from crying. He blinked, confused, until he remembered the fall, the snow, the darkness. Then he saw her hands trembling as she signed, "You could have died." He reached up, his rough fingers brushing her cheek. Then, slowly, carefully, he shaped words she could understand. "My strong woman. My heart." Her eyes softened. She leaned down and pressed her forehead to his. For a long time they stayed like that. No words, no sound, only warmth and breath and the slow return of life. When the storm finally passed 3 days later, the world outside was buried in white silence. The trees bowed under snow, the river frozen stiff. Elijah stepped outside, weak but alive, and looked toward the horizon where the dawn broke gold over the peaks. He had faced 10 winters alone, but this one nearly took him. When he returned inside, he found Clara holding something small and metal in her hands, a silver bell she'd found in his old chest, once belonging to his mother. She handed it to him, tilting her head curiously. He smiled, took a leather strap and tied the bell above the cabin door. It chimed softly when the wind moved it. Then he took her hand and signed clumsily, "When you see it move, I am home." Her lips curved into a trembling smile. She reached up and touched the bell, and it rang sweet and clear in the quiet cabin. It became their sound, the only one that mattered. A promise that even in the fiercest storm, she would always know when he'd returned. By the time spring thawed the last of the snow from Bitter Creek Ridge, word had spread down the valley. The mountain man and his deaf bride had survived the blizzard. Folks in town had wagered they wouldn't. They'd said she'd flee before winter's end, or worse that she'd freeze up there like the last poor soul who tried to love Elijah Boone. But they were wrong. When Elijah and Clara rode into town that April morning, it was as if the mountains themselves had sent a miracle. The sun shone bright on muddy streets. Chickens clucked behind fences. A few children stopped to stare, their mouths hanging open. Elijah sat tall in the saddle, his arm protectively near Clara, who rode beside him on her small gray mare, the one he traded 2 pelts for at the last supply run. She wore a blue dress he'd sewn himself, clumsy in its stitching but made with care. A white bonnet framed her face, and the breeze tugged at a loose strand of her chestnut hair. She smiled as she looked around, taking in every detail, the wagons, the shops, the curious faces. Though she couldn't hear the gossip that followed in their wake, she felt the eyes. Elijah did too. As they dismounted near the general store, Mrs. Harris, a stout woman with a mouth like a whip, was the first to speak. "Well, if it isn't Elijah Boone," she called out, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "And this must be the bride we've all heard about." Clara smiled politely, though she couldn't read the woman's lips clearly from that distance. She glanced to Elijah for a cue. He gave a small nod. "Mornin', Mrs. Harris." The woman's eyes darted to Clara. "She can't hear, can she? Must be awful lonely not being able to share a real conversation." The words cut like a cold wind. Elijah's jaw tightened. The crowd nearby went quiet, waiting to see what he'd do. Clara noticed the tension, her eyes flicking between faces, searching for understanding. Then gently she touched Elijah's arm and signed, "What is she saying?" He hesitated, then decided not to repeat the cruelty. Instead he took her hand and looked her in the eyes. "Nothing worth hearing," he said softly. Mrs. Harris gave a huff. "Well, I suppose it's a blessing she can't. Still, a man needs someone who can talk to him, don't you think?" Clara, catching a few of the words from Mrs. Harris's moving lips, realized enough to know what had been said. The entire street seemed to hold its breath. Then Clara turned toward Elijah, her brown eyes shining with calm certainty. She took his hand, right there in front of everyone, and signed slowly, deliberately so all could see. "I hear you here." Her fingers touched her heart. The gesture was so tender, so full of grace, that even those who didn't know her language understood. Elijah swallowed hard. He turned to the crowd, his voice deep and steady. "She hears more than any of you ever could." Silence fell. Mrs. Harris blushed and busied herself with her basket. The men at the feed store shifted awkwardly, pretending to study the ground. Clara smiled softly, unaware of the sting her quiet truth had left behind. After that day the whispers changed. People still talked, but not with mockery. With wonder. The school children waved when she passed. Jonas Wright tipped his hat with a grin. Even Mrs. Harris began sending fresh bread up the trail, by accident. Clara didn't need to hear their words to know. She could feel their change, in the way the townsfolk's eyes softened when they looked at her, in the way they tried to sign simple greetings she'd taught them. One day the preacher's wife even asked Clara to show the Sunday school children how to spell their names with their hands. Clara beamed, her fingers dancing in the air as the children giggled and mimicked her shapes. Elijah stood in the back of the chapel, watching. Pride filled his chest like sunlight spilling through storm clouds. This woman, the one everyone pitied, the one they said wouldn't last a week, had taught an entire town how to listen with their hearts. That evening, back at the cabin, Elijah sat whittling by the fire while Clara kneaded dough at the table. "You made quite an impression today," he said with a chuckle. "Never thought I'd see the preacher's wife learning to spell with her hands." Clara smiled, reading his lips, then signed teasingly, "She talks too much. My hands are tired." Elijah laughed, deep and full, a sound that startled him with how natural it felt. As the fire crackled, he reached over and took her hand. "You belong here, Clara. The town's better for you being in it. So am I." She watched his lips, then leaned close, whispering softly though she couldn't hear her own voice. "So am I." For a long while they sat together in quiet comfort, the mountain wind singing outside, the silver bell above the door trembling softly. And in that quiet home, where sound was scarce but love was endless, Elijah realized something he hadn't dared believe for 10 winters. He wasn't alone anymore. It was late summer when the letter came. The sun hung hot above Bitter Creek Ridge, and the air shimmered over the pines. Elijah had been splitting wood behind the cabin when he saw the dust of a rider winding up the trail, the postman struggling up the rocky path with a leather satchel at his side. Clara was on the porch, stringing herbs to dry when she noticed him too. She wiped her hands and smiled, always happy when visitors came. The mountain could be lonely, but she'd learned to fill the silence with joy. Elijah met the rider halfway down the path. You've come a long way, Nate. What brings you up this far? The postman tipped his hat. Letter for you, Boone. Came from back east, addressed to both you and your wife. Elijah frowned. Hardly anyone even knew Clara's name beyond the valley. He took the envelope, thick and pressed with a strange wax seal. Appreciate it. When Nate rode off, Elijah turned the envelope over in his calloused hands. The handwriting was neat and unfamiliar. He went inside and laid it on the table. Clara came to his side, curious. Her eyes flicked between his face and the letter. He mouthed, "It's for us." She nodded, eager. He broke the seal carefully. The scent of rose oil drifted out, faint but foreign to the wilds of Montana. Then he began to read. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Boone, I hope this letter finds you both well. I write to you concerning Clara May Whitlock Boone. Clara's father passed this spring. In his will, he named her the sole heir to his estate and holdings in St. Louis. If Mrs. Boone wishes to claim her inheritance, she must present herself within 6 months, or the estate will be surrendered to the Crownwell Trust. Respectfully, Charles Benton Esq. Whitlock and Benton, attorneys at law. Elijah lowered the page slowly. His heart was thudding not with excitement, but with fear. He looked up at Clara, who waited expectantly, searching his eyes for meaning. He hesitated. Then, softly, he signed, It's from your father's lawyer. He's gone. You have an inheritance. Lad. Money. Clara froze. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Her eyes shimmered with disbelief. She shook her head. No. My father disowned me. He said I brought shame. Elijah reached across the table, taking her hands. People change. Maybe he wanted to make things right. She swallowed hard. For a moment, she looked small, the strong, confident woman of the last months replaced by a daughter who had once been cast aside. Then she signed slowly, If I go, do I return? The question hit Elijah like an axe splitting wood. He didn't answer at once. I'll take you, he said finally. You deserve to know. You deserve to be seen by the world for who you are. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. You come too. That night, they sat on the porch in silence, the stars bright above the peaks. The air was heavy with thoughts they couldn't quite say. Elijah stared into the dark forest and said, half to himself, 10 winters I waited for something real. Thought it might be gone when spring came like everything else. But not you. Clara reached over, touching his cheek. Then she signed, Love is not a place. To. The words nearly broke him. He pulled her close and kissed her forehead, whispering, Then we'll go together. Weeks later, when they rode through town to catch the stagecoach east, the people of Bitter Creek Ridge gathered to watch them off. The preacher shook Elijah's hand. You take care of her, Boone? I will, he promised. Mrs. Harris pressed a small bundle of bread into Clara's hands, her eyes kind now. The children waved their hands in the air, spelling goodbye in sign language the way she taught them. Clara's eyes glistened. She waved back, fingers trembling, her heart torn between two worlds, one of quiet mountains and another of echoes from a life she'd left behind. As the coach rumbled away, Elijah looked out the window at the mountains shrinking behind them. For the first time he didn't feel fear in the leaving. Only hope, and something deeper he couldn't yet name. Because neither of them knew what awaited in St. Louis. But both felt the wind changing. And for a man who had waited 10 winters for love, Elijah Boone was finally ready to face whatever storm came next, so long as she was by his side. 6 months passed before the mountain saw Elijah Boone again. Autumn had returned to Bitter Creek Ridge, the air crisp, the first hints of snow dancing on the wind. The town had almost stopped talking about the mountain man and his deaf bride. Almost. Some said they'd gone east and never looked back. Others whispered that Clara had found fine company in the city and forgotten her rugged husband in his cabin of pine and stone. But the truth was far different. One cold morning, as dawn spilled gold over the ridge, a wagon rolled down the valley trail, its wheels crunching frost and gravel. Behind the reins sat Elijah Boone, taller somehow, a quiet strength in his eyes. Beside him, Clara smiled beneath her bonnet, her cheeks rosy from the wind. The townsfolk stopped in their tracks. Mrs. Harris nearly dropped her basket of apples. Elijah Boone, she gasped, you've come back. He tipped his hat with a grin. Told you I'd only be gone a spell. The preacher hurried out of the church, children ran from the schoolyard, and before long the whole town was gathered near the square. And then as Clara stepped down from the wagon, a murmur rippled through the crowd. In her arms, wrapped in a soft wool blanket, was a baby. A tiny bundle with dark hair and eyes as bright as the morning sky. The mountain man, who had once lived in silence and solitude, was now a father. The town stood still, breathless. Then the preacher's wife clasped her hands to her chest and whispered, "Mercy, they've got a child." Elijah chuckled, his voice warm. "A daughter. Name's Hope." Clara looked up, smiling as she signed the name for those who understood. Her fingers traced the letters, Echui, slow and graceful. The children who had learned from her mimicked the signs, their faces glowing with excitement. It was then that something happened that no one expected. Clara lifted her daughter gently, her eyes shining, and began to sing. Her voice was soft, faint and trembling like a spring breeze, but it was there. Gasps filled the square. Elijah's eyes widened, tears instantly forming. The doctor's wife, who stood near the front, covered her mouth and whispered, "She can hear?" Elijah could barely speak. "A little," he said. After the birth, she began to hear faint sounds. The doctor said it's a miracle. But Clara only shook her head, smiling through tears, and signed, "Not my hearing, my heart." It opened. And when she placed baby Hope in Elijah's arms, the little one giggled, a sweet, musical sound that echoed off the mountain walls. Every soul in town heard it, the sound of life, of love, of two people who had turned silence into song. That evening, as the sun dipped low, the people of Bitter Creek Ridge gathered at the edge of town for a small supper to welcome them home. Children tugged at Clara's skirts, eager to show her how much sign language they'd learned. The preacher toasted them both, calling it proof that the Lord can speak even through silence. Elijah looked across the firelight at his wife, the woman who had once arrived frightened and uncertain, and now glowed like a lantern in the dark. When the stars came out, Clara sat beside him, the baby asleep in her arms. She looked up at the mountain that had once been her prison and smiled. She signed softly, "This is home." Elijah took her hand, kissed her knuckles, and replied, "Always." The fire crackled. The baby sighed in her sleep. And above them, the first snowflake of winter drifted down, gentle as a blessing. The town would tell their story for generations. How the mountain man waited 10 winters for love. How a deaf bride taught them to listen. And how silence, once feared, became the sound of everything good.